Around 3000 BCE, power in Mesopotamia was brutal, simple, and unquestioned. Authority survived on force. If someone refused to work, soldiers arrived. If someone resisted, punishment was public. Fear was not hidden, it was performed. The entire city was meant to see what happened when obedience failed. For a time, this worked. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash expanded faster than any human settlement before them. Tens of thousands of people lived behind walls, worked the same fields, depended on the same grain stores, and followed orders issued by a small ruling class. Violence created order, and order created growth. But growth created a problem no ruler expected. The cities became too large. There were too many workers to threaten every day, too many fields to guard, too many lives to control through pain alone. Soldiers could beat people into submission, but they could not manage an entire civilization with whips and executions. Fear produced obedience, but it also produced exhaustion. Some people fled into marshlands. Others sabotaged canals at night. Many stopped caring whether they lived or died. And when people stop fearing death, violence loses its power. This was the moment rulers did not record on stone, but it changed history. Violence stopped being enough. The danger was not rebellion or invasion. It was something quieter. The realization that fear could no longer hold everything together. So power adapted. Not with a new law, not with a declaration, but by redesigning daily life itself. Instead of asking how to punish disobedience, Mesopotamian rulers began asking how to make survival impossible without obedience. This shift did not look dramatic. There were no mass arrests, no sweeping reforms. Life simply became conditional. Grain that once stayed in private homes moved into temple and palace granaries. Water access depended on canals controlled by officials. Work was assigned through schedules recorded on clay tablets. Attendance was tracked. Absence was noted. Nothing about this felt violent, and that was exactly why it worked. If you wanted to eat, you needed to be part of the system. If you wanted to be part of the system, you needed approval. If you wanted approval, you needed compliance. No soldier had to stand over you. Hunger did the job instead. Leaving the system did not mean freedom, it meant starvation. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, control had started disappearing from sight. Soldiers still existed, but they were no longer the main instrument of power. Administration replaced intimidation. Routine replaced terror. Dependency replaced fear. People followed rules not because someone threatened them, but because their survival depended on it. This is where invisible control was born. In cities like Lagash, life followed a rhythm designed by others. You woke up, worked, received rations, and repeated. Your name appeared on a tablet you could not read. That tablet decided whether you ate. Memory did not matter. Intentions did not matter. Only records did. And here was the critical detail. Most people could not read. That meant they could not challenge the system. They could not argue with numbers or schedules. If a tablet said you owed grain, you owed grain. If it said you failed to work, you failed, regardless of the truth. You could fight a soldier. You could not fight an accounting system. This is when power stopped dealing with individuals and started managing populations. Control became abstract, impersonal, and therefore difficult to resist. No one was being punished. They were simply being processed. Religion reinforced this structure. Floods were not administrative failures. Famine was not mismanagement. Suffering was cosmic balance. If life was harsh, it was because the universe demanded it. That belief mattered more than violence ever could. When people believe suffering is meaningful, they endure it. When they believe suffering is arbitrary, they resist. Invisible control works by making hardship feel inevitable rather than imposed. By around 2300 BCE, under the Akkadian Empire, this system reached maturity. Sargon of Akkad did not rule primarily through terror. He ruled through organization. He standardized administration, controlled trade routes, managed food supplies, and integrated conquered populations into economic systems they could not survive without. The rebellion became irrational. People did not wake up feeling enslaved. They woke up feeling dependent. That difference changed everything. The most effective control systems do not announce themselves as control. They present themselves as order, stability, and normal life. People stop asking whether the system is fair. They start asking how to survive within it. And once survival depends on compliance, compliance no longer feels forced. It feels necessary. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, control had not disappeared. It had become normal. And when control feels normal, questioning it feels dangerous. This is the foundation of every successful empire that followed. Not constant violence, but structured dependence. Not fear alone, but necessity disguised as choice. In the next part, we will see how this system reshaped human psychology, how obedience expanded without force, and why people began enforcing the system themselves long before any soldier arrived. Because the most powerful systems in history were never the loudest. They were the ones you stopped noticing. Circa 2300 to 1800 BCE. By the time violence stopped being the main tool of control, something more dangerous had already begun to grow. People had started adjusting themselves. No soldier stood at their door every morning. No whip followed them to the fields. Yet they woke up on time, showed up for work, followed schedules, and accepted quotas without being threatened. Power no longer chased people. People chased approval. This was not accidental. It was psychological. Once survival depends on a system, the mind adapts faster than the body ever could. Fear of pain fades, but fear of exclusion does not. Being cut off from food, work, or protection feels worse than punishment because it feels permanent. That fear reshaped behavior. People stopped asking what they wanted. They started asking what the system expected. And that shift changed obedience forever. In Akkadian and post-Sumerian cities, daily life became predictable by design. Predictability reduces resistance. When tomorrow looks exactly like today, questioning authority feels pointless. Routine numbs curiosity. Habit replaces rebellion. You wake up, you work, you receive rations, you repeat. The system does not demand loyalty, it demands participation. And participation slowly becomes identity. A worker is no longer just someone who labors. He becomes a record, a quota, a name tied to a tablet. His value is measured in output, not intention. Once people are reduced to numbers, obedience becomes technical, not moral. You are not obeying power, you are following procedure. That distinction matters more than it seems. This is where obedience expanded without force. People began policing themselves. Not because they loved authority, but because deviation carried risk. Missing work meant questions. Questions meant records. Records meant loss of access. Even a small mistake could echo across your household. So people corrected themselves before the system needed to. They arrived early. They avoided attention. They followed norms, even when no one watched. Control no longer required confrontation. It operated through anticipation. What will happen if I fail? That question lived permanently in the mind. The most effective psychological shift happened quietly. Authority stopped feeling external. Instead of thinking, they demand this, people began thinking, this is how things are. The system no longer felt imposed. It felt natural, inevitable, even fair. Religion strengthened this belief. Gods did not merely support rulers, they explained reality. Success meant divine favor. Failure meant imbalance. Hardship was not evidence of injustice. It was proof that the universe was working as intended. This belief neutralized anger. If suffering has meaning, there is nothing to fight. And if there's nothing to fight, obedience feels rational. By this stage, power no longer needed to convince people. It only needed to maintain structure. The structure itself trained behavior. Children grew up watching their parents follow schedules and accept records without question. By adulthood, obedience felt like common sense, not submission. This is the moment control crossed a critical threshold. It became internal. No empire can survive on force alone. Armies are expensive. Violence creates enemies, but a population that enforces order on itself is cheap, stable, and efficient. Ancient rulers may not have understood psychology the way we do today, but they understood results, and the results were clear. Consider what resistance looked like now. The rebellion was no longer just dangerous, it was irrational. Leaving the system meant losing food, work, and social recognition. Even if someone hated authority, survival demanded compliance, so most people did not resist openly. They adapted, They learned the rules, they learned how to stay invisible, they learned how to survive inside the system rather than challenge it. This is not cowardice, it is conditioning. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, this model spread beyond Mesopotamia. Egypt, the Indus Valley, and later empires adopted similar structures: centralized storage, bureaucratic records, ritualized labor, sacred authority. Different cultures, same mechanism. Control through dependency, obedience through routine, stability through psychology. Once the pattern worked, it never disappeared. Here is the most unsettling truth. Most people living under these systems did not feel oppressed. They felt normal. Their lives were difficult, but difficulty was expected. Hardship was not evidence of failure. It was evidence of adulthood. The system did not need to justify itself. It simply existed. And when a system exists long enough, it stops being questioned. This is why invisible control lasts longer than any violent regime. Fear burns out. Violence provokes resistance, but necessity trains patience. People can endure almost anything if it feels unavoidable. That is the psychology empires learned thousands of years ago. And once learned, it was never forgotten. In the next part, we will follow this pattern as it expands across empires, adapts to new cultures, and repeats itself with terrifying consistency. Different rulers, different gods, same structure. Because once humans learn how to control themselves, power no longer needs chains. It needs systems. Circa 1800 to 1200 BCE. Once invisible control proved it could work, empires stopped treating it as an experiment. They treated it as a weapon. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, rulers no longer asked whether people could be controlled without constant violence. That question had already been answered. The only question left was how far the system could be expanded without breaking. The answer was simple: as far as it could travel. Empires began spreading not just armies, but structures. Conquest no longer ended when a city fell. It ended when daily life was reorganized. New rulers did not need to terrorize populations into submission. They only needed to replace local systems with imperial ones. Grain storage was centralized, labor was standardized, taxes were recorded, calendars were synchronized. The moment a conquered population depended on imperial systems to eat, rebellion became a luxury they could not afford. This is how control crossed borders. Take Babylon in the 18th century BCE. Hammurabi is remembered for his laws, but the laws were not the real innovation. The system behind them was. The Code of Hammurabi did not merely punish wrongdoing. It categorized people, ranked them, and assigned consequences based on status. Justice became procedural. Once justice becomes procedural, power feels impersonal. People stop seeing punishment as the ruler's choice. They see it as the system doing what it must. That belief disarms anger. You are not being punished by a man. You're being processed by order. This model repeated again and again. In Egypt, the Nile flood cycle was integrated into labor schedules and taxation. Farmers worked not because soldiers forced them, but because grain redistribution depended on compliance. Temples tracked offerings, scribes tracked output, gods explained suffering. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro showed signs of centralized planning without visible militarization. Control did not announce itself. It embedded itself in infrastructure. Different cultures, same logic. Power learned that if you control water, food, and time, you control behavior. By now, obedience had evolved again. It was no longer just internal. It became social. Communities began enforcing norms on themselves. Anyone who threatened stability threatened everyone's access to survival. Non-compliance stopped being a personal risk. It became a collective danger. So people intervened before authority needed to. They warned neighbors. They corrected family members. They reported deviations quietly. The system no longer needed eyes everywhere. People watched each other. This is the moment where control reached its most efficient form. Violence was reserved for extremes. Administration handled the rest. Most people never encountered punishment directly. They encountered reminders, records, and expectations. Power became distant. And distant power feels permanent. When authority is always present, people resist it. When authority is abstract, people adapt to it. The system does not threaten you, it surrounds you. By the time you notice it, it already owns your routine. Here is the critical pattern. Empires stopped collapsing because of rebellion alone. They collapsed when systems failed, when grain did not arrive, when records broke down, when logistics failed. People did not rise up because they hated authority. They rose up because dependency stopped working. That is the hidden weakness of invisible control. It must function. As long as the system delivers survival, obedience holds. But when access disappears, when promises fail, the psychology reverses. The same people who once enforced compliance begin questioning everything. Not because they suddenly became brave, but because necessity vanished. This is why ancient rulers obsessed over administration more than ideology. Belief could be flexible, systems could not. A broken system exposes power. A functioning system hides it. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, this pattern had hardened into doctrine. Empires did not need to reinvent control. They inherited it. New rulers stepped into structures already designed to shape behavior. The system outlived kings. That was the final evolution. Power was no longer tied to a single ruler or dynasty. It lived in records, schedules, infrastructure, and expectations. Remove one king, another could step in without changing anything important. People did not serve rulers. They served continuity. This is why ancient control feels familiar. Not because history repeats itself exactly, but because the mechanism never changed. Only the tools did. Clay tablets became paper. Paper became screens. But the logic remained intact. Dependence first. Obedience second. Violence last. The quieter the system, the stronger it becomes. In the final part, we will pull everything together. We will trace this ancient design into the modern world, not with lectures or moralizing, but by showing how the same structure still shapes choices, behavior, and obedience today. Because the most dangerous systems are not the ones that command you. They are the ones that convince you there is no alternative. By the time ancient empires perfected invisible control, something irreversible had happened. Power no longer belonged to kings. It belonged to systems. Rulers came and went. Dynasties collapsed. Cities burned. Yet the structures of control remained standing. Grain storage, records, schedules, obligations, belief. Remove the crown, and the machine kept running. That was the final success. Ancient rulers learned that violence is fragile. It requires presence. It creates resistance. It exhausts both the ruler and the ruled. But a functioning system does not need constant attention. It trains behavior quietly. Once people organize their lives around access to food, work, protection, identity, obedience becomes routine. Routine becomes a habit. Habit becomes culture. And culture does the work power no longer has to. This is why the strongest empires did not rely on fear alone. They relied on normal life, continuing tomorrow exactly as it did today. Stability was the real weapon. Look back at Mesopotamia, Akkad, Babylon, Egypt. The common thread is not brutality. It is a dependency. People were not held in place by chains. They were held in place by schedules, records, and needs that could not be met outside the system. Leaving did not feel rebellious. It felt suicidal. so people stayed. They adjusted expectations. They narrowed ambitions. They learned which questions not to ask. Not because they were weak, because the system made alternatives invisible. This is the part history books often skip. Most people under the empire did not feel constantly oppressed. They felt tired, busy, focused on survival. Power does not need your loyalty if it has your attention and energy. When daily life consumes you, resistance feels distant. That is not accidental. The final illusion of invisible control is choice. Ancient systems did not tell people what to believe every moment. They shaped the environment so that certain choices felt rational and others felt impossible. People chose compliance because non-compliance came with consequences they could not afford. That is how freedom quietly narrows. Not through bans, through costs. And once this model existed, it never disappeared. It adapted. Clay tablets became paper. Paper became databases. Granaries became supply chains. Scribes became administrators. The tools changed. The logic did not. Power still prefers dependency over terror. Systems over soldiers. Routine over resistance. The quiet methods always last longer. Here's the most uncomfortable truth. The most successful systems do not need to convince you they are fair. They only need to convince you they are unavoidable. Once that belief settles in, people stop asking whether the system should exist. They ask how to survive within it. That is when control becomes complete. Ancient empires collapsed when systems failed, when food stopped arriving, when records broke down, when access disappeared. Until that moment, obedience held without force. The lesson rulers learned was simple and devastating. As long as the system functions, people will tolerate almost anything. This is why studying ancient power matters. Not because we live in the same world, but because we live inside the same logic. Invisible control does not shout. It does not threaten. It does not announce itself. It organizes life so thoroughly that resistance feels unrealistic. And once people stop imagining alternatives, power no longer needs to defend itself. It becomes the background of existence. The most powerful empires in history were not remembered for how loudly they ruled. They were remembered for how long they lasted. And they lasted because people stopped noticing who was in control.